Insights Exchange, conversations shaping academic research. Nikesh Gosalia speaks with Phil Baty on remote learning, AI in higher education, and university rankings.
Hi, everyone. Today's guest is an international authority on university performance and strategy. He has 25 years of experience in global higher education, including a decade as editor of the Times Higher Education World University Rankings. He is an award-winning journalist and highly sought-after speaker. He's the creator of the THE World Academic Summit and oversees the team that organizes the event, which engages tens of thousands of senior university leaders, business executives, and policymakers annually. Everyone, please welcome Phil Baty.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Can you tell those who don't know what is Times Higher Education? If you can talk a little bit about your history within the company, what kind of roles have you played, and what were you responsible for?
Thank you very much. Well, that's a very big question. We describe Times Higher Education actually internally as a 51-year-old startup. We have a heritage that goes back to 1971. So we just recently celebrated our 50th birthday. But really, our heritage goes back to being a weekly newspaper for primarily the UK higher education sector. We were a spin-off of the Times of London. So we were originally called the Times Higher Education Supplement. We were a supplement of the Daily Times, focused on higher education. It was all about content and traditional media and some job advertising, primarily in the UK. But we really dramatically changed our outlook, changed our vision. And today we really see ourselves as a global data and insights business. I think it all changed in around about 2004 when we first published the World University Rankings. That became an extraordinary global phenomenon. There was a huge gap and a real appetite for people to understand comparative data, to compare universities across borders in what was rapidly emerging as a global higher education sector, a global community with increasing global mobility, increasing global research collaboration. So everything changed really from 2004. We moved dramatically into being global, and we moved dramatically into being data-driven in our approach. So that's the origins of THE. Today, we are the largest platform for university professionals globally. We recently acquired Inside Higher Ed in America. So between ourselves and Inside Higher Ed, we have around about 50 million people come to our websites every year, and they're all professionals, academics in higher education, and some students who look at rankings as well. We run international events. We have a consultancy business, and our core mission, of course, around data and analytics and insights is still very much part of who we are and the driving force of who we are. My personal journey started in not even 20, started in 1996 when I joined Times Higher Education as a very junior news reporter. I had actually had an even longer association with Times Higher Education. I was a freelance writer as a student in the mid-90s, but I joined in 96 as a junior reporter. And I just fell in love with the higher education sector. The writing news about the sector was inspiring. It was varied. The universities are the greatest force for good in the world, as far as I'm concerned. So it was a pleasure and honor to report on higher education and to understand the higher education sector. And I've just stayed at Times Higher Education for pretty much my whole career, more than 25 years now, in varying different roles. And now, of course, I'm the Chief Knowledge Officer. My responsibilities include a lot of our public engagement, increasingly a lot of our work with governments. We do a lot of consultancy with governments. And as you mentioned very kindly in your introduction, I created the World Academic Summit and the World Summit Series. So I also look after our international events business. And that is a wonderful global community of academic leaders, administration and academic leaders who connect across the world for various summits and forums to share good practice, to meet, network, and really to drive forward the success of universities globally. So it's a huge honor to have the role I've got and a huge privilege to have been working in the sector for such a long time. I often pinch myself that I have such a wonderful, privileged position in higher ed, and I'm incredibly lucky and incredibly grateful to have this opportunity.
I guess everybody within the industry and perhaps even outside, so aspiring students, research institutes, universities, governments, really look forward to the THE University Rankings. It is highly prestigious. Could you talk a little bit about how do the university rankings work and what are some of the critical data points that you are tracking for these universities?
So it's very important that rankings are transparent. We must understand the data that goes in them, and that they're not really very valuable unless we're able to be very, very transparent about the methodology. So, of course, happy to explain. The World University Rankings, the flagship Times Higher Education ranking, is based on 13 separate performance indicators, which we think cover the whole of the core missions of a research-intensive global university. So we have 5 metrics looking at what we call the teaching environment. That's looking at teaching factors that will influence teaching, such as faculty-student ratios, resources, reputation. We look at research in a very in-depth way. We look at research reputation. We surveyed 30,000 scholars around the world this year for our reputation surveys. But also when we were evaluating research, we evaluated 15 million individual research outputs and more than 100 million citations to those outputs to understand the influence, the reach, the quality of each university's research. So it's a huge data undertaking. But as well as teaching and research, we also look at international outlook, so a university's connections with the international community through research collaboration. We look at the ability of universities to draw in international talent, both among faculty and staff, as well as students. And then we look at industry links as well. We look at a university's connections to the sort of so-called outside world of business and industry, their ability to attract funding for R&D projects from the private sector, from industry. So we think it's the most comprehensive, the most balanced evaluation system. The Times Higher Education World University Rankings give you a very holistic, big overview of a university. A lot of rankings can be much more narrow, much more focused on specific areas. So we give the holistic view, which is actually fantastic for the opportunity to evaluate and monitor performance at the institutional level, but also, of course, at the national level. We also have other rankings. We believe there's no single correct version of excellence. There's no right or wrong answer when it comes to excellence. Different metrics measure different things. So we also look at universities' social and economic impact. So we have what we call the impact rankings. They use the Sustainable Development Goals as the framework for evaluating universities' impact. And we look at that in 4 aspects. We look at a university's research, their ability to bring new ideas, new thinking, new knowledge in driving forward the Sustainable Development Goals. We look at their teaching again, provision of skilled graduates and their activities in the fields of each of the SDGs. We look at their stewardship, their management of their own resources and assets, their people, their campuses, make sure they're doing that in a sustainable way. And also we look at their outreach to the wider community, to governments, to businesses and to charities. So we have a huge array of metrics for a very, very wide array of institutional activity. We have many, many millions of data points. And most recent world rankings, we had more than 2,500 submissions. We should be ranking about 1,800 universities in the next ranking in October 2022. So we're sitting on this wonderful data resource, allowing us to see universities on the ground.
The amount of work that goes behind getting these rankings in place, I mean, that's just phenomenal. Since you mentioned SDGs have grown in prominence over the last couple of years like never before, but fair credit to THE, I think you'll already perhaps, anticipated it is really, really going to be extremely important for everybody in this world to, look at the SDGs. Can you talk a little bit about how did the process work? How did you all go about anticipating and coming up with those rankings? And how do these sustainable development goals play a role in the rankings?
Yeah, of course. So obviously we've been producing the world rankings since 2004. They had become a gold standard, a way of understanding excellence in a rather traditional way. Excellence in terms of world-class research, world-class reputation for academic excellence. It tended to be a ranking that privileged those very wealthy, elite North American and Western European schools. It was Harvard, Stanford, and MIT, and Oxford and Cambridge, making the top echelons. And it is quite an Anglo-Saxon model of excellence, that university perfected in this sort of post-war era in the United States. So the world rankings do sort of measure a particular type of institution, but we understand at Times Higher Education, because we're global, because we work within the sector deeply, we understand that excellence can come in many forms, many shapes and sizes. And, inequalities of wealth, brain drain, shouldn't be a way of detracting from the great work that universities can do in more challenging conditions with less resource. And of course, we also found that governments around the world wanted to understand what they're getting in return for their investment in universities. How much of it is esoteric research that's great for scholarship and learning, but governments, taxpayers want to know, what impact are our universities making? Are they changing the world? Are they driving the economy? So for several years, we've been under pressure to say, how do we measure impact? How do we measure the impact universities make to society? And in many ways, that's often looked at as economic impact. Do they have spin-off companies? Do they create intellectual property that gets converted into a product that makes money? Do they have licenses and IP? But we also wanted to understand impact in a much more profound way. Universities change society. They fuel democracies. They create engaged global citizens. They fuel the economy through skilled workers. But also they address some of the world's biggest challenges. Climate change cannot be solved without universities inventing things, developing new technologies, pushing us into alternative energy sources, constantly innovating. The pandemic showed us as well that universities will be the key to getting humanity out of these tremendously challenging, awful situations through rapid development of vaccines. We draw upon the great global body of knowledge that was already there in terms of understanding pandemic and the coronavirus variant that hit the world. So we'd been seeing this pressure to understand impact for many years. We finally cracked it, actually, after many years of scratching our heads, when Duncan Ross, our Chief Data Officer, realized that the Sustainable Development Goals provided almost the perfect framework to understand impact. They're all agreed by the global community. They're all understood to be incredibly pressing, and they're all interrelated. So, if you address quality education, you can then bring sustained citizens and bring in, can address issues of inequality. Through education. If you address gender, you can bring greater talent and make sure we're fully utilizing the talent we have in society. Through universities, we can drive economic growth and innovation. Through universities, we can tackle climate change. So it was when we aligned on the SDGs as the framework, which was probably in sort of 2017-18, we realized that that was the way of framing impact in the most broad, multidisciplinary way we can. And then it was a question of almost working with the UN goals in terms of what the indicators are, how we would measure that. We had a long process of consultative conversations about how to achieve that. And we were very, very ahead of the game in the sense that we published this ranking in 2019. It's exploded in engagement. The numbers of participants are exploding every year. And I think it really just hit the right moment that the world was looking to universities to demonstrate impact. The universities were looking at ways of proving their impact to their tax-paying public, to the governments and policymakers. And we also wanted to sort of help universities celebrate the impact they make. And the thing that's so powerful about the impact rankings, I think, is the diversity of excellence. The world rankings have just the US and UK in the top 10. The impact rankings have many more countries. They have countries in the Middle East, countries in East Asia, as well as Western European, North American countries. So the impact rankings show a much greater diversity of excellence. And universities are embracing them to say, we want to demonstrate we care about sustainable living. We want to show the world we have great impact, even if we don't always have vast wealth and resource. And I think what's interesting as well, students now are saying we want to test and challenge the universities to make sure they are committed to this agenda. We want to challenge them, make sure they're willing to be accountable for their contributions to delivering sustainable development. So it's been an incredibly exciting and humbling process, but now we do have this unique data set, an utterly unique way of understanding universities' impact on society across all of the 17 individual goals. So it's an incredible resource, and we want to try and turn that resource into action, supporting collaboration, supporting investment, helping universities find one another, helping funders of the SDG agenda to find pockets of excellence in higher education, helping individual scholars, of course, to promote themselves and give themselves visibility for contributing to this agenda. So yeah, it's been an incredibly exciting process, and it was a long time in development, but we're delighted now we seem to have really hit one of the most important issues facing universities today, which is proving impact and demonstrating their sort of social commitment to making the world a better place.
Absolutely, Phil. I fully acknowledge that. I remember talking to one of my colleagues who, in his previous life, I think worked as an impact manager for one of the universities. And the first year when the SDG impact rankings were out, I think, we were discussing that we'll monitor how this goes. We'll see the number of participants. And yeah, I think this sounds interesting. But the very next year, like you correctly mentioned, the number of participants and the whole framework and the rankings just exploded. Like you said, it's not easy work. There was a lot of years of work, but just so perfectly timed and such a useful set of framework that's out there now. Just going back on the whole issue around rankings, Phil, I'm sure you've kind of heard both sides to the whole ranking and the mechanism and the framework. In your opinion, why do rankings matter and how should we look at them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously they can be very controversial and they do provoke heated conversations. Look, if we're really honest, rankings do reduce universities and all their wonderful complexity to simple numbers. The aggregate scores can often hide nuance, hide pockets of excellence. The available data, the available metrics can often miss really amazing things universities do. So, of course, rankings can be inherently simplistic, inherently crude, so they're by no means infallible. I think what's exciting about rankings is their potential to genuinely provide information that doesn't exist and insights. It's actually very interesting that the origins of the Times Higher Education ranking actually came not from the demand for consumer information for students. It actually came from the government. There was a government report by the former head of the Confederation of British Industry who wrote a report for the UK Treasury back in 2003 called the Lambert Review. And the Lambert Review said, we need to understand our investment in research in British universities. How does it play out globally? British universities compare themselves domestically. They have no mechanism for understanding themselves against the rest of the world. They shouldn't be competing domestically. We should be competing globally. And we want a mechanism for evaluating the strength of our universities, the competitiveness of our universities on a global stage, and really our position in the global knowledge economy. So the original driver came as a tool for governments to provide policy insight, policy development opportunities. And that's how we originally built the Times Higher rankings. We actually were serving first the needs of a university sector wanting information about their strategy, information about their strengths and weaknesses, information about their performance relative to the world on a world stage. And it was only really after that the students embraced this as a fantastic tool to help them inform decisions. We had an explosion of international student mobility over recent decades, students increasingly looking to the world for their education, investing really serious money in the most important decision of their lives, who to trust with their higher education, which university to put your time and engagement in. And then they became a massive consumer tool after that. We get tens of millions of students coming to our site to look at the rankings to help them make decisions. So the point is, rankings provide transparency. They provide genuine data and information and insights that are otherwise unavailable. They inform students and their families around making sensible choices. They democratize the university decision-making process for students and families. But more importantly, I think for Times Higher Education, in terms of who we engage with, they provide genuine insights to the people who lead and run universities about how their universities are performing. They provide genuine insights increasingly to governments. We're finding governments around the world want to work with us to understand and help them to develop and improve their university system performance, and to look at the size and shape of university systems and to support the development of higher education for the benefit of society. So, I feel very, very passionately that rankings play a really, really important and really, really positive role in the world. But of course, we have to make sure that we look at rankings in a critical way. Some rankings are much more superficial than others. Some rankings privilege certain factors that might have perverse incentives, how exclusive a university is, how high the barriers to entry are, which might encourage universities to close doors rather than open doors. So we have to be very, very mindful of perverse incentives, very, very mindful of rankings being too narrow or too superficial. But as long as we're clear and transparent on methodology and we can break the data down and share that data in the right format, I think rankings provide the framework of an incredibly important way of understanding the global knowledge economy and helping people make informed decisions. And that's the sort of driving force. So I accept and welcome constructive criticism. I understand some ranking organizations are more exploitative, more superficial, create rankings more as a marketing tool, but we feel our rankings are based on incredibly rigorous research and data and provide a really powerful tool for the global higher education community to make better decisions for the good of the sector and the good of society.
And I agree with you, considering the fact that there are just so many data points that go into the ranking, just so much of useful information, and we clearly need those rankings. Staying on with talking a little bit about the data points and the fact that you explained Times Higher Education goes into so much of details to put together the rankings. Are there some common trends that you've noticed through this data that might be worth sharing with the listeners?
I think in terms of trends, there's definitely a sense that's clear in the rankings over time that the world is changing. We have seen, I think, what should be seen as a very welcome shift in the balance of power, if that's the right way of phrasing it. Traditionally, in the world rankings, the West has dominated, as I mentioned earlier. The North America, in particular, Western Europe, have dominated the rankings. They tend to have had the benefits of brain drain from other parts of the world. The US in particular has obviously led the global higher education community as a magnet for talent, as leading institutions with very, very high levels of funding through controversial issues like high tuition fees, etc. But I think we're seeing a shift in the balance of power. We have absolutely seen over time a very clear rise of East Asia in particular. China has been leading that. So it's interesting that, nations have been able to make significant improvements to their university systems, and they've seen them really powering up the rankings. China, I think, had 2 universities in the top 200 back in 2016. They've now got 10. And actually China, if you look at the trend lines in terms of scores, China and America are starting to get much, much closer. And the US can't rely on its dominance forever. It is being challenged by other nations. So that's a really major theme. And that's not just China. You've got Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore also doing incredibly well. So that East Asia rising, the balance between East and West changing is a major trend. And that's about, it's about nations investing in knowledge capacity. China wanted a shift towards, partly China wanted that visible dominance as national pride. It comes into play, top-ranked universities, but actually it's about driving the knowledge economy. They were shifting their economy very much from manufacturing to knowledge and skills, and same in South Korea, dramatic changes to the shape of economy driven by outstanding universities and great research and great innovation. So that's a major, major trend. We're also now seeing, I think, that coming through in the Middle East. In Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, they're really building research capacity and getting very, very, very ready for the sort of post-oil economy. Digital transformation, skills, innovation, hugely important to those nations' future success. So Saudi Arabia, UAE doing very well in rankings, rising up quite rapidly. Actually, some of the North African nations, Egypt, I think is doing very well as well, having some great success. Pakistan's engagement is improving. And of course, India, I think some way behind China in terms of reform, but the educational reforms coming through for India. The focus on building capacity in India is also very, very exciting. So the most exciting thing for me in rankings trends is the reduction of any real dominance of any one particular nation or one particular culture for a much more equal and much more diverse global knowledge economy, which I think is good news for the whole world and good news for those Western nations as well, because sources of knowledge diversify, and it's the metaphor that a rising tide lifts all boats. It doesn't have to be, rankings are a zero-sum game in the way they're formulated, but actually strengthening in other areas doesn't necessarily mean others areas are weakening. It just means that, as I say, a rising tide lifts all boats. So that's an exciting big development I've seen in recent years.
And just to understand that better, I'm sure there are a lot of universities in different countries, different geographies, who are aspiring to improve their rankings. Typically, what kind of advice would you give to these universities on ways to improve?
Yeah, I think it very depends on individual missions of universities. But fundamentally, I think to rise up the Times Higher Education World Rankings, your strongest area would be to address research. So building research capacity, strengthening your research base. So a lot of that might be, really bringing on more and more PhDs, collaborating more internationally with other research partners, just strengthening in research excellence. I always think actually some of the lower weighted areas in rankings are actually some of the most powerful and driving improvements in performance, and they're the international metrics. So actually, we have a metric that rewards collaboration across borders in research, and we find that internationally collaborative research is more highly cited, it's more widely disseminated. So that strengthens the visibility of research, strengthens the citation, but also I think inherently improves the research base by sharing and collaborating with other scholars in other parts of the world, bringing diverse ideas to the fore, capitalizing on strengths outside the country. So that's really powerful. Attracting international talent, again, brings in additional voices and talent to the community, rises up in terms of the specific metric and rankings, but also improves those connections and that visibility. I do think there's a really important role for communications, though. A lot of work is just around how do you better communicate your research excellence? How do you disseminate the research you're doing in the most effective way? And a lot of academics, I think, can be skeptical about marketing and PR and comms, but actually it's a highly competitive, busy world out there. So if you've got scholars doing great work, you do need to find ways of communicating that. How do you disseminate that most effectively? How do you get that research noticed? And it's not just all about PR, it's about genuinely sharing your discoveries. How do you expose your discoveries to the widest audience? How do you make sure your incremental additions to knowledge are seen by other scholars and built upon by other scholars for the good of the research base and the good of society? So I do think universities could look at how they use social media, how they engage with the mainstream media. How do they find ways of communicating and disseminating in the right journals and often outside and beyond journals? It's an important part of the process, because obviously reputation, again, is also a big chunk of the ranking. We survey 30,000 scholars for the World University Rankings each year, and we ask them who they believe are doing great things. And that's based on their subject knowledge, but it's often based on papers they've read, conferences they've attended, social media accounts they follow, how they absorb information about who's doing great work in their community. So reputation really matters. Dissemination, communication, marketing, public relations, I think does really matter. But fundamentally, you won't rise in the rankings unless you're producing great research and high quality research and it's disseminated in the right way. Lots of lessons. I think mission specific. One of the things Times Higher Education does is we have the ranking itself and the 5 pillars that go into the ranking in the public domain, but we can break down the data to the 13 metrics and work with universities to say, okay, which of these areas do you have the greatest weaknesses compared to peers? You can select peers, select countries, benchmark yourself across all the 13 different indicators to find out where you have particular strengths or weaknesses, and you can address the weaknesses. And one of the things I love most about the data and analytics we do for universities is we often do a simple SWOT charter, strength, weaknesses, opportunities, threat, where we map the hard metrics of research excellence through citation analysis against the soft metrics of research excellence through reputation. And a lot of universities are doing outstanding work in particular fields of research that just isn't widely understood. You have a very strong bibliometric citation performance for a particular field, but a very low reputation. So we can actually work with universities to address that and say, well, the data shows you're doing outstanding work in this field, but you haven't communicated that to the rest of the global community, or particular regions or particular parts of the world don't know that. How about you look at a communication strategy? How about you look at a collaboration strategy to make sure people do understand the strengths that you do have? So yeah, it's very much varies by institution and their own particular missions, but and breaking down the scores. But there's a couple of areas where I think you can make some significant improvements. International collaboration, international talent, and communication and dissemination for me is crucial.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Phil. And I fully agree with you. I think in our experience, we are seeing similar trends working with academic publishers, scholarly societies, research institutes. I think there is an increasing need to repurpose content, the traditional content, just easy to understand formats, make it more discoverable. And like you rightly mentioned, Phil, I think there's just so much good stuff that is available out there. But yeah, it's not really going to work out if it's going to be not discoverable. And research institutes, researchers themselves, and the other stakeholders, if they don't talk about it, if they don't promote it, I think a lot of the benefits would really not be highlighted. Just staying with that topic, I know that THE offers consultancy services for universities, and because of such in-depth understanding of how they work, just numerous data points, understanding, what the gaps are. What kind of strategies does THE develop for universities? And is the whole research, promotion, reputation building also part of some of the offerings?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a traditional media outlet, we do a lot of work with universities to help them build reputation and brand. So, a lot of universities come to us just with very traditional advertising. We have this huge platform, as I mentioned, 50 million people on our platforms across Times Higher Education and Inside Higher Ed. So universities just wanting to communicate in the most simple way to the global academic community will come and run advertising with us or build content on our THE Connect pages and use the platform to push out their reputation. So as well as giving them some of the solutions around reputation through the traditional media platforms, we also are able to do a deep dive into their reputation themselves. So we have, of course, the hundreds of thousands of data points for our reputation survey. What do people think of you? How are you perceived? Which areas are you known for in terms of your research excellence by field? Which areas are you better recognized in terms of geography around the world? So we can do a lot of diagnosis around reputation, strengths and weaknesses. We also have a student panel and 150,000 international students we can use as a research panel to ask questions about reputation and how students perceive you. So we can do a lot of reputation work. And actually just recently we acquired a business called the Knowledge Partnership, which runs something really exciting for me called the World 100 Reputation Network. And the World 100 bit's slightly misleading because it's a network of university senior communication managers who literally join a membership community where they share good practice, they share insights and intelligence about what the best mechanisms for communication are in terms of dissemination of research and in terms of building your brand and reputation with different stakeholders, governments and students, the wider community. And that's a really exciting peer-to-peer group of people who just come together and share good practice. So one of our offers is around reputation management, reputation building, and then some solutions. We also do straightforward performance analysis. What are your strengths and weaknesses against all your competitors or your chosen benchmark institutions? We do social impact work. So, how do we make sure that you are maximizing your impact on society using the SDG database? Yeah, so we have a very, very holistic range of solutions. We increasingly support universities on their international strategies, looking at their international collaboration networks, looking at any gaps or weaknesses in the geography or subject areas in terms of their collaborations. So yeah, it's a really, because I think we have such a huge amount of data and also a great talented international consultancy team, we can increasingly take a very, very holistic approach to what is the university problem it wants solving. And we can build a bespoke solution. But I would say it really frames around performance analysis, strategic support around networks, collaborations, international strategy, strategic support around reputation and brand building, social impact, and more actually we're doing work with governments around the size and shape of national educational systems, national evaluation systems, national rationalization programs, mergers, etc., etc. So it's almost anything you want, to be honest. We've got this wonderful sort of single source of intelligence and information, which is proving very, very popular.
I know that there is the research excellence framework in the UK and perhaps many other countries, trying to adapt to it or maybe customize it to their requirements as well. Just like anything else, there are maybe two sides to the story. There has been some criticism around the research frameworks, but at the same time, UK in many ways has led just coming up with a framework and perhaps, improving it every 6 years. Just in terms of your opinion on the research excellence framework, does it work? Do you think universities need it? And if there are changes to be made, what would be your recommendations, Phil?
Yeah, that's a big question. It's interesting, actually, because I think a lot of academics love to hate the REF, as we call it, the Research Excellence Framework. It used to be the RAE in the previous incarnation. A lot of academics hate it. It's high stakes. It's grueling. It's a huge bureaucracy. It obviously puts a lot of pressure on individuals around their performance. So it is a huge and unpopular exercise and expensive as well to administer. But I have to confess, actually, I still believe it's a really, really important principle. On two levels. One, on the most rudimentary level, I think evaluating quality of research nationally is important. I think the transparency is always good for taxpayer funding. We do want to understand taxpayer funding that is incredibly hard to come by in difficult times is being spent well, and that universities are accountable for that and they are assessed for that. And there's no question that I think since assessment was introduced, the quality of British or UK research in general has been improving. I think that competitive element drives performance, focuses attention, focuses mind. So I think there is a fundamental point that it's, measurement is important. But actually what it does as well at the REF in Britain is that it is a really important source of funding. So we have the dual support funding system, which I think is brilliant. And perhaps one of the reasons why the UK does actually punch above its weight. The UK is relatively underfunded in terms of research. We're way behind the OECD average in terms of the proportion of our GDP that we spend on research. We've been talking about trying to hit the 2.3% for a long, long time. We're way short. We're a long way off. We are worse funded and researched than a lot of other nations, and yet we still perform incredibly well. And I think part of that is the evaluation system, but also this dual support element. So we have the research councils who will give out grants for specific projects, a competitive basis. You bid, you succeed or fail, you get grants for a specific project. And that's the lifeblood of many academics' day jobs. There's a controversy there about how high the failure rates are, how much time is wasted on failed grants. But ultimately, that grant system is, directed. We've got funding for these key areas, and you go and bid for that funding. But the Research Excellence Framework funding is what we call QR, just quality research. And based on that exercise, universities just get this massive lump sum. It's not always massive, but they get a lump sum that says, we've evaluated your research on the basis of your excellence, or your strengths. We're going to give you X amount of money, and it's yours, and you can do what you want with it. And for me, that's a really important principle because it effectively protects academic freedom. It protects that really rare opportunity for universities to have blue skies thinking, to have curiosity-led research, and it almost protects the sort of framework of academics and scholars pursuing curiosity, pursuing a blue skies approach. And they're often the ways that create the biggest breakthroughs. The most important research might come from areas where you don't know what the outcome will be, you don't know where it's going. So it balances the applied research saying, we have a problem, we need to solve it, or we have a widget we want to invent. And the other area, blue skies, we want to understand the world better. And we don't know if it'll be worth any money. We don't know whether we'll make a breakthrough, but we need to understand this. And by understanding it, you sometimes get the greatest breakthroughs. Over the course of history, so many of the biggest breakthroughs ever have been through research projects that didn't have a specific outcome in mind. They were byproducts. So I think the dual support system that the Research Excellence Framework funds is brilliant and really, really important, and it's been very successful for the UK. I think within that, of course, you have a lot of criticism of specifics. What are the metrics? What are the levers? And obviously, the minute money's attached, and actually in the UK, it's not just the money that's attached to the Research Excellence Framework, it's the prestige that's attached. It does inform how universities are perceived, how their league tables in the domestic scene are perceived. So reputation-wise and funding-wise, it's very, very important. So, of course, what you do find there is gaming. You do find universities doing whatever they can to game it. Whether that's the controversial bit, in the past, excluding scholars, saying they're not research active, not submitting them, so their careers are sort of damaged and they feel, it's a slightly humiliating thing to say you're not going to be submitted, you're not research active. There's all sorts of gaming around, do you go for quality or quantity? So do you submit only a very small number of your very best researchers to get a good score, but obviously you don't get much funding? There was a terrible transfer market where it's almost like the Premier League football, where the top researchers would be paid huge sums of money to defect and take their teams to another university, and they take their research with them. So it's not like a footballer who scores goals for Barcelona and then gets headhunted by Manchester City. They don't bring their goals with them. They have to start again. But so there's a lot of gaming and a lot of manipulation because the stakes are so high. But actually, each time around, they try and refine it. They try and improve it. They try and reduce gaming and tighten it up. And ultimately, the heart of it is a massive peer review exercise, human judgment, peer-to-peer expert judgment that sits on top of it all. So despite the fact that it's hated and it's problematic, I have to confess, and I'm not making myself popular here, I actually think it is a positive force for UK higher education. And I'm sure I'll get a lot of criticism for that, but fundamentally, it does the right thing for the right reasons.
I'm hoping that a lot of listeners are football fans like me. And I think that analogy was really well mentioned. And, I think, you hit home the point. Looking forward, Phil, I don't know if I can say that we are probably out of a pandemic or just, on our way. And during the last 2.5, 3 years, all of us and all of the industries had to adapt and make a lot of changes. Just looking forward, maybe due to the pandemic or even otherwise, how do you see the next 5, 10, perhaps 15 years as far as higher education is concerned?
I think there's no question that the pandemic massively accelerated our understanding of the role of digital remote learning in higher ed. Obviously, we were all forced overnight to go to remote learning. I think that what's probably been misunderstood is that a lot of cases people thought, it just means lectures have moved on to Zoom and they're boring and they're passive and it's all a bit it's all a bit inferior. But I think what's been clear to me is that there are cases of great innovation and great excellence and good practice in teaching in a remote environment with digital support. So there's no question there's been a very rapid acceleration of our understanding of that world, our ability to harness that world in a positive way. So I think there's probably a sense that there's no fully going back to the old ways. Of course, students want to be back on campus. Of course, the campus environment is still really important. Of course, in-person lectures have huge value. In-person interactions have huge value. But I do think we'll see a more hybrid world, where we try and harness the best of both. There's a lot of merit in being back on campus. There's a lot of merit in meeting face-to-face. There's huge advantages to that. But actually, there's some amazing opportunities in digital that we should harness, from, being more accessible to students, to giving students their access to information on demand, to capturing more of student behavior in terms of using sort of digital and data to understand and personalize their learning, to bringing in guest speakers from across the world, using some of these platforms to mix up the environment, the flipped classroom. You can bring in a guest speaker on an on-demand lecture from Harvard and have the students view that online on demand, but then you can then turn it into a rich seminar where on the ground in person you really explore those ideas and challenge those ideas. So I do think there's a wonderful hybrid world out there that we have accelerated. And a lot of universities have talked about, even though starting to really feel confident we're coming out of the pandemic, universities are often saying we won't go fully back. We will always now retain an element of hybrid. So I think that's here to stay. I think that raises questions about the sort of physical environment. I do think the idea that the campus is dead or in-person education is dead is nonsense. I think that's a huge exaggeration. But I do think universities will use campuses differently. Do they need a lecture theatre for 400, 500 students when they're all sitting in silence listening to a great, wise scholar? Is that an appropriate way of learning anymore? You can get that online. Should you use the spaces for more interactive learning, for more collaborative learning, smaller groups, seminars, problem solving? So maybe the traditional lecture is starting to phase out and to lose its relevance, even though it's been in place for centuries and it's been effective. I think people are recognizing it's not the best way to impart knowledge. So that's an issue. I think assessments, the forced move away from everyone sitting in an exam room in silence for 3 hours has probably asked people to say, hang on a minute, is that really how we should assess people's ability to thrive in the workplace or their ability to thrive in society? Do we ever really have those sorts of assessments? Should we not rethink assessment and be more thoughtful about how we challenge and test students' knowledge? How do they prove themselves in the real world? It's usually through teamwork, through problem solving, etc. So I think there's those sorts of changes will be permanent and accelerated. And I think it's good. I think it'll enhance the overall student experience. I mean, in terms of the future, one of the major pushes that we see everywhere is lifelong learning and micro-credentials. I went to a tech summit in Saudi Arabia not long ago, and a very senior chief executive of a learning platform said, what Spotify has done for music, what Netflix has done for entertainment, what Airbnb has done for the hotel industry, we're going to do for higher ed. And the hype was crazy that, who needs a university when you've got an education platform where you can just take bite-sized courses, MOOC courses, micro-credentials, build your own credentials. And I think that hype is misplaced. I think universities have been around for centuries for a very good reason. There's very important reasons why a 3 or 4 year degree, an immersive deep learning degree is right and appropriate. I think those skills and that type of learning will be essential for our future knowledge economy, the digital economy. We need problem solvers, deep thinkers, critical thinkers, communicators, contemplative people to get us through the future of uncertainty around AI, etc. But I think lifelong learning will be massive. So the set of skills you learn at university should be lifelong skills, qualities and attributes rather than actually technical knowledge, because your technical knowledge will need refreshing a lot. So I think a lot of flexible, a lot of on-demand, a lot of micro-credentials, a lot of credit accumulation transfer will be a normal part of education out there. Hopefully your degree will teach you how to learn how to think, but you'll perhaps have to keep going back to either universities for small courses or other providers in the private sector for bite-sized chunks, micro courses, flexible learning throughout your life. But I don't believe that the traditional university model is going to be fundamentally disrupted. I just think we're going to have a more blended economy, a more mixture, more entrepreneurial universities. But for me, the core 3 or 4 year immersive full-time degree will still remain incredibly popular and incredibly important. Just need to be flexible and creative around the edges of that in terms of widening access and letting people access smaller chunks of learning throughout their lives.
I fully agree with you. I think, yes, there'll probably be, some enhancements. There'll be changes to make the whole experience perhaps just more engaging, seamless, but the fundamentals probably won't change. Personally, even, I've decided to kind of go back to studying, to upskilling myself as part of lifelong learning. So I agree with you, Phil. I know you briefly touched upon AI. To kind of elaborate a little further while talking about the future of higher education, do you think technology, specifically, things like AI, do they have a place in higher education, or do you think it's highly controversial? There are some ethical issues.
I think it really depends on the application. I think on one level, inescapable. I think AI is just going to become more and more of a part of our world. It's going to be developing so dramatically. It'll be much more of an important part of our economy, much more of an important part of our daily lives, and also the workplace. Certain roles and skills could easily be replaced by more autonomous thinking machines, etc. So there is a sense it's inescapable. On one level, actually, I think that it almost makes the demand for university degrees in the arts and humanities more important, because actually we need ethicists, we need lawyers, we need philosophers even to cope with what it really means if we do get to a position, and I'm sure we will, where we can't differentiate between a thinking machine and a human being, and actually the dystopian ideas that machines could potentially subjugate humans. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that could be a reality. It's a science fiction nightmare that may well happen unless we actually create the right framework, the right structures to govern that properly. And I do think all the softer elements of university degrees around arts and humanities will play a massive role in that, genuinely understanding what humanity is in a world where AI could have really, really progressed massively. So I'm a massive fan of lawyers, ethicists, philosophers, historians to be really part of those conversations about how AI affects society. That's really looking at AI as society. In terms of AI in higher ed, I think, if it's governed properly and done well, I think it has extraordinarily potentially positive applications in, identifying talent, helping with admission processes, marking and providing feedback to student work. I mean, that could all be very positive if the correct ethical frameworks are put in place. And obviously we do know, even from these early ideas around, early AI, where human biases get implanted, racial prejudice almost comes through. You've got all sorts of things where the design of these things, human weaknesses and human prejudices creep through. I always remember hearing about a conference we did, and all the black delegates were all held up with the facial recognition systems because they didn't actually properly recognize and understand their skin color. Just really basic errors like that. You hear about all these bots that become prejudiced and unpleasant because they're learning from the data on social media, for example, and have all the human weaknesses there. So if we can have a governance system that prevents all those awful potential negative side effects, I think we should be thinking of harnessing AI in positive ways. Certainly around research. You think about basic elements of research where you have to maybe manually scan, in medicine, for example, are you manually scanning for tumors or abnormalities, the ability to extremely rapidly process information. Those sorts of benefits, I think, bring huge opportunity to higher education, harnessed correctly. So I think it's in the same way as its role in society is going to be highly provocative, highly controversial, and will require really serious scrutiny and ethical frameworks and governance. I think it could be deployed to very positive ways in society and in higher education with the correct degree of accountability, scrutiny, and guarding against some genuinely worrying negative consequences.
Thanks, Phil. I know that you wrote an article describing a global leveling up that's currently taking place. How would you describe the leveling up that's happening in the universities?
So I think that is something that really I touched upon earlier, actually, that when you look at longer term trends in rankings, particularly the world rankings, you do see that traditionally dominant nations are starting to wane a little bit in terms of the rest of the world catching up. So, in the world rankings that are coming out in October, we will see much greater representation from Africa, for example. We will see the continuing rise of the Middle East. I mentioned Saudi Arabia and UAE earlier on. They will continue to rise and show further progress up rankings. China and other East Asian nations will cement and creep up and show more representation. So I think it's really a sense that the rankings, the traditional world rankings have been massively skewed towards North America and Britain in particular and Western Europe. we will see that dominance is slowly but surely starting to wane. There's much more equal excellence out there, much more equally distributed excellence. It's still numerically the US, UK dominate, but it's starting to change. And I think that hopefully has a virtuous circle element that other nations get more prominence, other nations are better at retaining talent. There's not just such a straightforward brain drain from east to west, because that's traditionally been the case, hasn't it? If you're a student in India or a student in China, if you want the best education, you've always thought, well, I'll move, with the exception of IITs in India, I'll move abroad, I'll go to Britain, I'll go to America. That's changing rapidly now. There's many more universities in Asia, Central, Southern and Eastern Asia that can say we are world class now. We can keep hold of more of our talent. There'll be a virtuous circle. They're rising up rankings. Hopefully that means they retain more talent, they retain more equal collaborations and partnerships, and they strengthen further, and it's good news for the world. So that was my main point around leveling up. The other point that I'd make as well is that even our sense of what excellence is starting to change. I spoke earlier about the Sustainable Development Goals, and there's no question for me that actually the way the global sector has embraced impact and the SDGs as a mechanism for showing their excellence is almost starting to change how we perceive excellence. Is Harvard, let's say, Harvard is one of the very best universities in the world because it has very, very comprehensive excellence. It has world-class researchers across all departments. It produces research that's, the most prestigious. It attracts the best students. That's excellence in one measure, but what about excellence in social mobility? Harvard's not leading the world in giving opportunities to most talented young people from deprived backgrounds. It's not doing the best job in terms of making sure the doors are open to talent from wherever talent comes from, with whatever social backgrounds. And that is a form of excellence as far as I'm concerned. It's a role in society that's important. And so similarly, you might have, one university might get a Nobel Prize for a cancer treatment that's effective, but another university might not be doing that work, but they might be training, legions of nurses and healthcare workers that do such important work on the front line that saves many lives in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So I just think understanding excellence in different ways and understanding the contributions universities make can be multifaceted and highly varied is starting to change the way we look at excellence. And in those impact rankings, the nice thing is that, yes, we have UK Russell Group universities in the top 10, but we also have far less wealthy, far less prestigious universities from all over the world excelling in those rankings as well. So that's part of a leveling up as well, that it's not just rich Western universities that dominate. We're discovering types of excellence in other parts of the world. So yeah, I think it's a really positive force across higher ed that seeing more diversity and more global equality. And hopefully that drives further global equality as well.
I know that you read and, you write a lot yourself about a variety of topics, but of course, about higher education, about universities and future of education. I think what a lot of listeners will benefit from, Phil, is how do you keep yourself updated about the industry?
Well, one of the greatest sources, actually, I have to admit, is Times Higher Education itself. So, as I mentioned, we've been around since 1971 as a source of news. So we literally have a great, great army of journalists who are writing about the sector. So in the UK, we have roughly 20 journalists. We have some journalists representing us in Europe. We have a journalist representing us in Australia, looking at the Asia-Pacific region. And of course, because we also have Inside Higher Ed, the other platform that's in the Times Higher family, we have a large number of journalists in Washington, D.C. covering America. So we actually have journalists whose full-time job it is to tell the world what's happening in higher ed. So all of those individuals are experts in their field, who give news and analysis and commentary on everything that's going on in the world. And that's, for me, being immersed in that means I feel like I'm one of the best informed people out there. It's an amazing source of intelligence and information. On top of that, of course, you mentioned kindly in the introduction, and I think I mentioned it, that I run the Times Higher Education events. So the World Academic Summit is an annual gathering of very senior leaders, 400 presidents and very senior managers of the world's best universities. They gather every year. This year are in New York. Next year we'll be in Sydney. And they explore the biggest things that keep them awake at night, their biggest challenges, the biggest changes to the sector, all the issues. So that becomes an amazing source of information. And of course, that event is annual, but we have spin-offs. We have the Asia Summit, we have the Emerging Economies Summit, we have Leadership Summit. And then we also have events around the world for digital universities, for different job titles. So we have the Digital Universities Week series, which is all about how universities are coping with digital transformation. But not just in the teaching and learning, but through the institutional management and also research. How is digital transforming the day-to-day lives of academics and students and researchers? And then we also have something called THE Live. It's actually called THE Campus Live. THE Campus is a resources platform where academics around the world share good practice. They literally come onto the platform and provide resources to say, how do you solve this problem? How do you deal with this issue? Everything from good delivery of teaching online, right through to equality and diversity, right through to sustainable development, early career research. There's an amazing community of academics sharing good practice. So that resource exists on the website, but then we have a meeting across different parts of the world where those people come together and again share best practice. And that can actually be from everything from marketing and communications right through to the day-to-day job of delivering great quality education to students. Good practice, trends, problems, analyses, new ideas. So yeah, it's brilliant. I'm immersed in a world that allows me to fully access some outstanding thought leadership and outstanding journalism content. Of course, on top of that, I read other publications as well and try and absorb a lot from social media. I'm quite active on LinkedIn. I'm quite active on Twitter. I try and, pick out the gems from my community of social media friends and colleagues to see what they're reading and see what they're sharing to absorb as much information as possible. So yeah, media is the key for me, but the THE events are outstanding in terms of giving insights and understanding where the world is heading.
This is really, fantastic because I'm sure a lot of listeners will benefit from the fact that there's so much depth around the things that THE does. And so thank you for sharing that. I know you are extremely passionate about this industry, higher education in general. And, throughout the conversation today, I can see that you've highlighted that particular aspect. But any interesting moment or experience that stands out probably in your career that made you feel all of this is worth it? It's so good to be in this industry doing what I do.
I could be slightly facetious and say every day I have that feeling, but it is true. I do feel privileged every day. I guess there's a couple of moments that stand out on a personal level. I guess one was I remember standing in the Rashtrapati Bhavan with the former president of India, standing up on a stage in front of hundreds of people talking about our emerging economies rankings and hearing the late president, talking about how this data it supports the national system in India because they need those benchmarks, they need those comparisons. And that's quite humbling when you think, the data you're providing, the information that you're publishing is helping to shape policy and hopefully helping to promote quality decision-making and improving the university system. But probably the most humbling for me is when I get the real privilege of addressing the Times Higher Education Summits. So I'm not a scholar myself. I'm a journalist through trade. I've been a journalist for many years, and now obviously I'm a business executive to a large extent. But because I run the Times Higher Education Summits, I get the privilege of standing on a stage and welcoming our guests. And actually, in just earlier this year, I managed to place myself on the podium where they give out the Nobel Prizes at Stockholm City Hall. So only because I'm organizing the event, I got to stand at that podium and give a speech to 300 or 400 guests in the beautiful setting of Stockholm City Hall, but also at that moment to release the impact rankings and to welcome onto the stage with my colleague Duncan, the winner, the number one ranked university leader from that ranking. And I think in that moment to understand that what Times Higher Education is able to do in sharing data, in convening the community and bringing the sectors from all over the world together. We are the facilitator of their excellence. We don't drive anything. We are there to support and facilitate and convene and inform with data and analysis and content. But just knowing that we brought together this amazing community of change makers, of leaders, of people passionate about the social impact, passionate about how to make sure universities do genuinely make the world a better place. It was unbelievably humbling. And then the personal privilege of standing in a place where so many giants of academia and research had been was particularly special. So yeah, I get a lot of those amazing moments, but that was probably a big standout for me.
And I know what you mean. If you're really passionate about what you do, then there are these kind of moments that happen pretty much on a daily basis because you're just so passionate about making a change. I know you've mentioned you are involved in so many things there are events to run, there's traveling. I'm not sure even if you have one, but how does your day look like outside work?
Well, I have to confess, I've got an incredibly narrow life outside work because I do dedicate so much of my time to work. And obviously I don't really work in 9 to 5 because the community we serve is global. So we're often working in different time zones. And if we're not physically traveling, we are doing slightly less travel to support the environmental impact. We reduce our travel, but when we're not traveling, we might often do meetings and have conversations at all hours across different time zones. So I am ridiculously busy. I mean, to be frank, I have two priorities. One is, and this is in no particular order, one is Newcastle United. I was born and raised in the northeast of England, and I am a fan of the football club Newcastle United, the Premier League team that's always usually on the brink of relegation, but it provides a focal point, an outlet for me. I don't get to go to that many games live, but I do follow as much as I can. So that's a nice outlet. And also a link back to my home community. I've lived in London for 30 years now, but I do feel strongly about my home roots and get up there as much as I can. So that's one passion. And my other passion is I do have two kids who are reaching one 18-year-old and one 16-year-old. So their own, making sure I'm as supportive as I possibly can be of their own ambitions and their own goals and dreams, and to be there for them. I don't often talk about my kids because I think they deserve that privacy, but they're my priority.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Phil. I highly appreciate that. And being a football fan myself, like I said, I'm looking forward to the new season and lots of changes at Newcastle United as well. So hopefully they'll have a great season.
We have another hour podcast about Newcastle, to be honest, but now is not the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The team that I follow, the least that we talk about them is better. I've been a Man United fan all throughout, and I guess I'm still living in the past. So yeah, the less we talk about it, the better. Thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure, absolute pleasure to talk, and thank you for your engagement and your time.
We would love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Feel free to write to us at insightsxchange@cactusglobal.com or drop a comment on LinkedIn. Any feedback, questions, and perspectives are what makes this exchange of insights so valuable. So thank you, everyone.